Okay. All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to episode 4 of The Robots Are Coming. I'm Ken,
I'm Michael.
and this is ASUC Senator Nicole Anyanwu. And on this episode, we'll be having a conversation about big tech censorship, especially in relation to data mining, encryption, with the relevance of acts like S3398, the Earn It Act, possibly threatening individuals' rights to speak out on various social media forums, especially to Black communities and narrative. And internet censorship is a huge deal, especially as it pertains to the way people get their information and the way the media presents itself. And can you introduce yourself a little bit, Nicole?
Yeah, so my name's Nicole. I'm a fourth year at the university. Very involved in like a lot of things in relation to the intersection of like health and tech. I'm definitely interested in this conversation. I do a lot of work on campus in different avenues in terms of like, I'm in the Funk Fellowships. So like that's a fellowship that like comes at the intersection of health and technology. So do like a lot of work and research there. Also in like ASUC, so do like a lot of like advocacy things related to that. And just like a lot of other avenues on campus in terms of like getting students informed, having them have like dialogue about like different pressing topics and like really like changing people's opinions.
Yeah, cool. And we're going to jump right into our first question. Do you think, in your opinion, social media has an equal playing field for all voices, especially for minorities who have been traditionally suppressed?
No, and it's sort of shocking, and like I feel like you can break it down like many parts, but like I feel like no, like the general answer is that generally like depending on like what racial background you have or like just the type of like microcosm or like the people that you keep around you and the beliefs that they hold.
Mhm.
I feel like that can do a lot to impact your social network or what exactly you see on your social media. I feel like algorithms like play a lot into that. A lot of people, especially like one platform that I think has been a very, very like big platform of contention in the past couple of years has been Facebook. And
Mhm.
it's mostly because of the fact that not only are there like, younger adults like us using it, but a lot of older people use it as well. And there's been a lot of things with like targeted advertisements, like, the whole infiltration of like fake news and all of that.
Right.
And it's been difficult for people to really navigate like having their own perspective when a lot of their timeline is filled of people with like the same ideals. And that's also led to like a lot of problems, and we've seen like the manifestation of that in elections, but also just in being vocal. Like if we look at different platforms, for example, on YouTube, like there's a big thing where like a lot of people are talking about how there's not visibility for like creators of color,
Yeah.
and like that's been a big thing. Like they tend to have lower subscriber counts, or they tend to have to do more in terms of like putting on tags onto their videos to get more views and to
Mhm.
reach more people. And like I understand like some people are like, oh, like, but whenever like you're in a marginalized group or you're talking about something, it could be like a niche topic. But it seems like it's almost as if these videos are being like adamantly like suppressed and certain videos are being uplifted. And like we've seen this on a multitude of platforms. I feel like definitely one thing that's been quite terrifying in terms of like free speech and like the ability to like express one's like ideals and opinions, especially if they're of a marginalized background, has been like just the whole influx of like the tagging of hate speech and like the policing of speech on like social media platforms. We see a lot of this on like on platforms like Facebook. We see it on YouTube. You see it a little bit on Twitter. Like there's some videos on YouTube now, like if you say like anything related to like race, like you get demonetized. And like why are we demonetizing videos or demonetizing like creators
Yeah.
just because like they're talking about like what could be controversial topics, or like those topics that even though not everybody agrees on, like there's rub there that like sort of gives people the ability to think a little bit outside the box. Even on Facebook, like for example, like if you go on Facebook and you say certain things now, like like I've had personal experience with that, like definitely like on Overheard, like
Yeah, could
I'll
you?
go on Overheard and like unfortunately like there's been times when like it's either like the admins have adamantly like flagged my
Mhm.
things and they're like, oh, it's like political commentary when it has nothing to do with like politics, that or like even like Facebook itself, like their algorithms will go and flag my post
Oh,
because I'm
really?
talking about something like, you know, what they consider racialized or political, but it's
Mhm.
not done in depth to where like they can differentiate when people are trying to like critique or talk about something and when people are actually committing the action. So I feel like there needs to be a lot more work done in terms of like, you know, making sure that they're delineating between like people critiquing such actions and then people's like, you know, actually spewing hate. And I feel like it's also a question of like what is censorship in that regard, because like why does any corporation have any like say in like silencing what I have to say on social media? And that's been a big topic of debate for a lot of people and a lot of majority groups too, like along the political spectrum, ideological spectrum too. Like, and I feel like that's also a difficult thing to also reconcile whenever you
Mhm.
talk about like things like KKK or like far right groups or like terrorist groups, like having access to social media and using that as a tool to like connect and like, you know, be together and like organize like, you know, things that could be resulting in like deaths and crime, but like technically like is that censorship? So it's like very like multifaceted.
Yeah, so you bring up a lot of good points, Nicole. And I have to admit, I never heard of you until yesterday when Ken actually
Mhm.
sent me a change.org link of a petition that started
Yeah.
regarding the overheard at UC Berkeley and Confessions incident, where they took down your post,
Yeah.
and very recently. And yes, so that's how I got to know you. So it's very clear that you have been through uh, experiences where you felt like you've had your voice suppressed in the past, and especially in an environment like Berkeley,
Yeah.
uh, where African Americans are certainly the minority. But you also bring up like just the role of the social media platform in general. So obviously, like we've seen the role like algorithms and data had to do with this, but also the admins and the people in charge of these groups.
Mhm.
So let's sort of like break this into two parts. One being like the algorithms and the recommendations and the advertising, and secondly being like the admins of these groups and the people behind it. Which one do you think like should we start with regarding reform? Like, do we go to these tech companies and say, you should change your algorithms, or should we have just go to the admins of these groups and try to change, try to
Mhm.
create change from there?
Mhm.
Which side do you think we should start on first?
Definitely, I feel like it's a very nuanced question because I even feel like there's like three tiers to it. Like, I feel like there's the local tier, which I definitely think is the best form to like advocate, like going to the admins of the group themselves and being like, okay, like you need to look at what you're censoring, because technically, like it's sort of funny because a lot of the times when the admins had censored things, it wasn't necessarily something that Facebook had censored. It's like they had censored it and then Facebook also censored it because like it started getting reported because they had reported it. But then there's also other incidences where like Facebook will actually flag that material and it's not up like on default of like the admins, but then like that could also jeopardize the page or even get it closed down. So like that was like internal conversation and dialogue that we were going back and forth between like, okay, like the instances in which like the admin like deliberately went and like censored things on their own, which I don't even think they could possibly have like jurisdiction over, because like there's no way to be objective in censoring things. I feel like in terms of like censorship or like flagging things, like in that case, like an algorithm is definitely superior, but one thing that we know is that it's not perfect. And that's why we still do have like the tagging of materials that aren't necessarily like, you know, hate speech or like racialized or political, but like just happens to fall under the algorithm because that's how wide it's spread. And I feel as if there's three prongs, as I said. So it's like talking to the admins definitely is like one thing. Like that's one thing that has been done. And, like it looks like they're loosening up on like their policies in terms of like censoring speech, especially from students of color, because I thought it was really interesting because me as a Black student, like there were lots of Black students who had posted things on that page. Myself particularly, I post a lot on that page. Like I used to post a lot on UC Berkeley memes as well. Like I love like being a part of like that online community and like seeing those like, you know, overheard things or like seeing those memes, and like it's a part of the community that I feel like every student wants to be a part of, but just in the way that they navigated stuff and the way that they flag things, but let like, you know, certain non-majority groups say this, but like, you know, certain minority groups couldn't say this, or like they always instigated or thought that just because I said something, and it was inherently also tied to like my background and my race, like because I said something it's politically charged when I'm just trying to be objective. So it's also like looking at like implicit biases, and I know they're doing a lot of work on that even at big tech companies. Like how could they use like algorithm tech and like data mining to like sort of, you know, go into discovering what are implicit biases and like using machine learning to sort of track those things. So I think that's super cool, and like that's something that like they're on the verge of discovering, but it's still like, you know, being like looked at. And then I think the biggest one or the biggest avenue would be like government, and like the way that government censors or like, you know, goes and intervenes in social media. We see a lot of that like around the world in different forms, like even like from my parents. Like my parents are originally from Nigeria and their home country, like in the country of Nigeria, like they were trying to actually have a censorship bill for Twitter, because they said like too many students, too many youths were going on Twitter and like, you know, spreading like things that were against like the government, or like trying to like, you know, move and have more mobility than they wanted them to. So it's also like it could be a tool of like, you know, silencing the youth or like the younger generation, or people who are, I guess, like more radical, or like more radical in either direction, not even like radically left. And I think like the most interesting thing is like looking at like the Earn It Act and like what it was intending to do, and like the implications it can have for students, and like not only students but like just youth, like members of society, and like especially like activists or like people who are like going to protest, and like their safety as well.
Yeah, and you brought up a really good point on the Earn It Act, which you know, can you talk a little bit more about what it is, and you know, how it possibly threatens individuals' rights to speak out on various social media platforms, especially as it pertains to, you know, Black and brown organizing and narratives?
Yeah. So basically, the Earn It Act is basically focused a lot around encryption. And basically what they were trying to do with this is that they were trying to use it to actually start looking into like child like exploitation and sexual battery charges online, just because we know like there's a lot of issues online with like, you know, child pornography, like a lot of like predators online. And like that's something that's always just been like something that children have grown up hearing, or like just students and like, you know, young people have grown up hearing like they're creepy people on the internet, like, you know, and you never know who's who, like you could get catfished or whatnot. But then again, people are worried about how this encryption law could actually like violate like possible constitutional rights under like the First and Fourth Amendments. And people are worried for two reasons particularly: for free speech and for security. And a lot of the reasons why is like free speech in terms of like with this new law, like a lot of these things or a lot of things that are said, they're going to be able to like go into like service providers and look at how are they like managing their platforms, what is the content that they're giving to their users, but then also what particular data are their users like looking at, and like what particular things are they like more likely to like, you know, speak on or like look at. And I feel like that's also pretty dangerous given like the current climate. Like I understand the intentionality, because like, for example, if somebody's online and they're looking up like something like, oh my God, like young 13-year-old child, like like inappropriate things like that, it's good for that because like it could be like tagged, like you could see like the history, it could see the type of content that was generated for that person because they searched these things a lot on the internet. It could be used to give intel. But at the same time, it can also be dangerous for people who are trying to take a stance on certain issues, people who are protesting and people who are activists on these platforms, because we have seen like there's this new age of surveillance that a lot of people are very, very worried about. For example, like a lot of these protests that have been happening, like a lot of students, a lot of just students even at Berkeley, like a lot of people in the general area, a lot of like young adults, members of society have been going on social media talking about how they've been tracked, how like police have followed them home, have been able to locate their personal information, or like they were able to tie them to this even though they may have not had any relation to like a particular event that happened, but they just happened to be there or happened to be searching these things. And it leads into like a dangerous territory, like, okay, because I'm speaking out on these issues, are people going to be looking at me more closely or suspect me of being like somebody who's involved in crime or involved in uproar or involved in targeted attacks? And I don't think that's the case. I feel like a lot of people on social media just like to be loud sometimes, like, you know, and they like to like, you know, vocalize how they feel, and they're hoping that their message reaches a larger audience and like will go the lens to say what they want to say or make sure like everything on their page is talking about a particular issue. And I don't think they should be targeted for that. I don't think that they should be like banned for that. I don't think that they should be like searched or like watched for that. And like it's really interesting because it also ties to other platforms, as I said. Like for example, there was someone on Reddit the other day that I saw, because I like to like look on Reddit sometimes too. Look like I like a lot of different platforms. So it's on there, and there was somebody who had actually went on there and they're like, oh, rice wars. And basically it was a very popular post like from yesterday, I think, but they were like white rice versus brown rice. And they were talking about how they hated brown rice. But then I think it got reposted to the mildly infuriating thread, and it basically what had happened is like they got permabanned because they thought that that person had typed out race war or race riots.
Wow.
So it's interesting. It's telling us like, you know, like what type of things that they're targeting and like they're censoring, and like what type of things that can get you banned even though you don't necessarily mean those things, or like you're just having conversation in the area of where that is, but you're not as radical or you're not as, you know, to the extreme of what they think you are. So that's led to like a lot of issues that we've seen recently, and just a lot of concern for people, especially with like, you know, addressing like free speech, privacy laws, like data mining, and just like the ability to like speak what's on somebody's mind.
Yes, yeah, and I we definitely appreciate you voicing your perspective on this. You know, with social media platforms, uh, there's a long history of this debate of, you know, what sort of role these platforms actually play. Like since the 1996 Section 230 Act, you know, many of these platforms have been invoking like the law saying they're a publisher, they're a platform, not a publisher. And then you know, there's been many critics who say they've just been hiding behind this law so they could essentially be relieved of any responsibility to monitor the content. But you know, that has also led to many great things like activism being possible and many liberal voices being heard. So with regarding to this specific S3398 Act, so your opinion is that it's breaking sort of a fundamental primitive guaranteed by the Constitution in terms of free speech. You know, this idea of giving the government a backdoor into the user data. So could you tell us like what you think perhaps like the intention of this act was, and how, and whether or not, you know, it, you know, based on its implementation, it could lead to consequences not that, you know, doesn't align with the intention of its lawmakers.
Yeah. So like definitely for me, one thing that I think is worth noting is like it's more about like what do we want social media to look like in the next couple of years, and what would be the scope of what we put on there. Because I feel as if like a lot of people, especially like the general public that wouldn't necessarily have like the educational access that a lot of people do have to know about like these things. Like a lot of people go on these social media platforms thinking that they're harmlessly like messaging people, or they're harmlessly posting things online, and they don't know that once it's online, like it's online for good, or like a lot of people can have access to this information. They're not aware that companies are selling their data to other companies to like target them and get them interested in a whole host of different avenues and products. Like they're not aware of how like the system underneath is sort of being manipulated. So I feel like it's also like a question for ourselves in the future. It's like, to what extent will we have a relationship with social media, and to what extent are you willing to give up your privacy for like a public persona? And I feel like that's something that people should also like be thinking about into the future, just because like I know for a lot of people, like online like platforms are also a way that they document like a lot of their personal lives and a lot of things that are happening to them that like maybe the typical person wouldn't share out loud, right? But at the same time, like that, once that information is out there, it's out there, and like it could be utilized to either like do good, or it could be utilized for the benefit of a corporation, the benefit of the government, or maybe could even backfire on you in the future. So people have to be like more cognizant about that. And in terms of like just like them delineating themselves as like, no, like we're just like a platform, we're not a communication medium, or we're not a press forum. I feel as if like that's also a good thing. I wouldn't say it's a bad thing. I think it's a good thing, because it's allowed for a lot of free flowing thought, for a lot of people to have hard conversations. I feel like Facebook is definitely one of the top places that you would think whenever you're thinking about, oh, where are people battling it out and having hard conversations, or seeing something on their timeline that maybe like rubs them differently just because they don't have the same opinion, but it gets them started on having that conversation. And most of the time whenever we think about that, I would think about Facebook. Where I think about where am I sometimes in like a microcosm of my own thoughts, it could be like a Twitter sort of thing. And then sometimes when I think about like where people being like their rawest and truest selves, I'm thinking like Reddit. So I feel as if like there's a lot of different platforms for a lot of different things. And like I feel like one interesting aspect that I think has been really, really like a point, like something that I've been like very interested in and having a lot of conversations with people about, is like activism on Reddit, which it can borderline like how does that work, because a lot of the audience on Reddit like tends to be a little bit more on the conservative side for the most part, or like that could be like an opinion maybe that I have, but like that's just something that like I've observed. And it's there's a certain audience that goes to Reddit, and especially since like there's that anonymity aspect, a lot of people can like freely say like things like maybe that they wouldn't say like out loud or attached to their name. So it also comes at a cost of like wondering, like with these new acts or with these new laws, or as time develops, will these like anonymous platforms really just lose their anonymity like over time anyway? Because like as it progresses, we get to a point where like even if you make this anonymous account, like we still know who you are, we're still collecting that data, and we're still like gonna come for you as a thing. So like I think like definitely like it's done a lot for having hard conversations, like allowing people to like speak their truth, allowing for like the connection of like protests, and like just allowing people that are like marginalized to have voices. And like one thing that I've really thought that's been powerful about it, like as of right now, is just the accountability aspect, especially if we look on Twitter, just because like there's a lot of people who go on Twitter, and like you could see like Twitter honestly like documents like evidence of like so many gross misconduct or like injustices on various like platforms, whether it be like, oh, like it's about like police brutality, or like it's about sexual harassment, or it's about this. And like it seems as if because the way Twitter is like intertwined, or the way that it works, like you can even like Twitter can it's sort of ridiculous, but Twitter can almost identify people before like the police or the government can. Like that's just crazy how there's that power in a social media platform like that. So like there's a lot of awesome things that come from it, but there's also a lot of scary things that come from it. And I'll touch on that real quick, but like I think some of the scarier things that come up from it is like the possibility for doxing, possibility of threats, squatting, and just like surveillance for sure.
Yeah, you bring up a lot of good points. I mean, on the one hand, you have social media as a really good potential outlet to express one's opinion, to organize. And on the other hand, you have all these social media companies taking our data, right? And the amount of data we produce every day is like really mind-boggling. Like, I think there's around 2.5 quintillion bytes of data that we create every day. And that's a ton of data. And, what do you think of like acts in the future that will make, data as a sort of property, right? Like allowing ourselves to own our data.
To add one more thing on this, so you talked a lot about the potential mishaps and benefits of social media, how it could be double-edged. But recently there has been, many ideas floated about on changing sort of the fundamental premise of these platforms, of, like data being your property, right? Or like with this S398 Act, the possibility of adding a backdoor to these databases. So do you think that there should be a change of some of the premise of these platforms? And if so, like, what do you think those premises should be, and why should it be changed?
Yeah. So like honestly, like it's such a deep question that y'all ask right now, and I honestly have like so many thoughts. But one thing that comes to mind is like there's always like I feel like in the next coming decade there's gonna be a great upheaval with like who possesses the right to the data, and how is that viewed as property, and like is it viewed as property, and who owns the property. I definitely think in terms of like thinking about data, like in the terms and conditions of things, I feel like people don't like tend to read those things when they join on these platforms. But like there's ways that these companies could like subtly like, slip in the fact that they do have the access to your data choose to partake. I feel like that's something that people are going to have to work to be cognizant of if they're wanting to participate on these platforms in the future. And like I definitely also feel like there's going to be a lot of pushback on like data mining, and like also pushback on like who owns like data and the property aspect of data, just because a lot of people feel as if like their thoughts are their own, and like they also feel as if like their information should not be shared with companies or people outside of themselves. There's a security blanket or like distrust that they have with the platform, that they would believe that the platform wouldn't like go and manipulate or exploit their ideas or the things that they share on there. But we're coming to realize like that's at the baseline, like just not true anymore. And it's just coming to a point where we're gonna have to decide, are we going to willingly be a part of this experiment, or are we going to like, come back and like, maybe mobilize, maybe have grassroots efforts, or even talk to like government officials about like what is the steps towards taking like our property back, like, and like it's also an interesting thing that you bring up with that, because there's also a debate now about once you join a platform and you become a big creator, is it going to become the intellectual property of the platform that you're a part of? I think one of the biggest platforms where I've seen that become an issue is more so YouTube. Like, for example, like one thing that a lot of people don't really discuss, or like maybe some people don't know, is that for some professors, once they come under the University of California name, or like once they come under the name of a public institution, their work technically becomes the ownership, or their research becomes the ownership of the university. So like it's interesting because it's like, maybe are we going to be seeing these same rules of like, you're utilizing our platform, or we're investing in you and you're utilizing our resources and we're giving you a platform, but now this is our intellectual property? Are we going to start seeing this with like a lot of online forums, a lot of online blog websites, or even YouTube itself? Because like, to an extent, it's also become like that sort of atmosphere on YouTube as well. Like there are a lot of people who go on YouTube and they have pages that are dedicated to just talking about like Black issues, or they have pages that are dedicated to talking about like being, a Muslim American person, or they have like, just pages being like documented talking about like their queerness. And like sometimes like it's interesting because like those certain subjects tend to be like, demonetized, as I said, or like, the video can be banned or like removed. But like then there's certain like, palatable like YouTubers that are put to the forefront that we're seeing, and they're the ones getting monetized, even though sometimes like the behaviors and the things that they promote could be borderline unethical and have like bad social implications for society. So it's becoming a thing of like, how like is YouTube influencing like, like the way that our society and our generation is even functioning, by like, the things that they promote to us, the things that we're seeing. And like even the trending page, like that, I remember like a couple years ago, that was a huge thing because people started to realize the trending page wasn't necessarily what was trending at the moment, but what YouTube wanted to trend.
Yeah.
And that could have such profound influence on like what people see and like what people visualize and think, especially if they're unaware of the fact that YouTube had the power to like manipulate what they're seeing. So that's like definitely a big question that I know a lot of people are looking into, and like I'm really curious to see how that plays out as well.
Yeah, and I think like a case study that we can look at to study many of these questions is actually the Chinese government.
Mm-hmm.
And especially, since I went to middle and high school in China, I could speak a bit about like the social media platforms there.
Mm-hmm.
With WeChat, it's sort of this one size fit all app, and like does everything for you. You shop, you pay people, you have your friends, you chat, you even like reserve dentist appointments, everything on that one app. And that app's data is owned by Tencent, the company. And sitting on the board of those companies are Communist Party officials.
Mm-hmm.
It's required that there's officials sitting on every big tech company once they reach a certain size.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the incidents, I think it was sometime last year, when Xi Jinping made like a big announcement on Hong Kong. And I forgot like which incident it was, but like, he made like some big law on Hong Kong. It was passed through like the Communist House, and they were like debating about it. It's supposed to be like a huge political. It had huge political implications, but the trending stories on WeChat and on Weibo, which is another social media platform, were all about like really senseless things, and they did it on purpose so people's attention could be distracted away. They were, I think, one of the top trending articles was like, how do you eat noodles on a train? So it's completely ridiculous in terms of the power that the government has in keeping people ignorant about what's happening in politics and etc. So we see with China, you sort of have this one extreme where the data is completely owned by the government, and even the companies and what they could do, where they get their subsidies, how they're funded, everything is sort of dictated by the government. In the US, you sort of see something similar, arguably, with like companies, like the extent of influence the companies have in terms of how your data is used. So So with with this recent movement, it's about we could potentially let the people have the right over all this data, but we're not sure like how far this idea will go, and
Yeah.
because it's such a paradigm shift.
Mhm.
So we're wondering like should what your opinion is on should the data be owned by the company, the government, the people, and then if they're going to be continuing to be owned by the companies, like what sort of new accountability measures should
Mhm.
we add to
Mhm.
prevent many of these negative
Yeah.
uses that you mentioned?
Yeah. So like definitely thank you for sharing like that narrative and experience, and like that's very insightful for me as well. And I definitely do feel like for me, like I feel like there could be like possibly in the future like a balance between like, ownership by the company and like civilians. But I do feel like we could go into like a territory where like in the future, especially with like, a lot of the monopolies or like they're monopolies that are forming that we're seeing. It could get to a point where like these companies have so much power that they are dealing with the government, and there's a lot of particular examples of this. For example, like Amazon does a lot of investment in like facial recognition tech, and like a lot of facial recognition camera wear, and they had like a partnership with like the government over like utilizing these in like streets and like in different cities across the US, and it also became like an issue of like surveillance. And it was really funny because like it was only recently like surveillance and like facial recognition software was actually knocked out of being used in Berkeley. And it's so interesting because like that's something that's so like local and so close to us, but like now like we're realizing like we're on new territory where like we could also be like surveilled and like looked into. And I feel like that's why we need more people as well going from like political science or legal aspects into like tech litigation and tech law. And like I have a lot of friends that I know that are like looking at those intersections, whether they're in CS and they're looking to like go on and do like future PhDs where like they're focusing on like what are the intersections between media and technology and what would that look like through a law lens, or them like going to law school and going into like litigation and like formulating these new policies that would like help protect like the user experience. But then we also see like a lot of companies that are actually seeking a lot more law students to do tech law and tech litigation. Like for example, like now like companies like Google and Facebook, they actually do have like a lot of like law internships that are particularly for students looking for the intersection of creating tech policy in the future. I feel like that could be a great thing if we do have people who are doing it to like sort of like go into like the civilian lens, but it could also be a borderline dangerous thing or a borderline questionable thing if we're seeing like companies going and like recruiting these students to work on policy for their particular company for them to benefit from it. And the thing that scares me is like it also comes into like this whole conversation about like who has power and like just like the dynamics of like even class privilege in America and like the 1%. Like once we think about these companies are getting so much money that they're almost in a place where they're untouchable when it comes to like civilians suing, like smaller companies suing, or even where they're at the place where they can even be the ones to be negotiating with the government or making deals with the government. And like that should be something that I feel like for a lot of like citizens should be questionable and like should warrant a lot of us having like discussions about like what that's going to look like in the future. And I think a lot of it also like making sure like that power doesn't get overridden and like doesn't get to like broad to where like they can have like so much control is like looking back at like anti-monopoly policies for sure. Like I feel like it's my personal opinion, but I just personally don't know what I would do with $1 billion. I'm not one to say like like oh like like oh like they didn't work for it. Like, I'm not one to say that, but I definitely think that, like, once we do get to, like, people making certain amounts of money, it's sort of questionable why we aren't taxing those people to utilize that money to invest in, like, high-speed railways where we can have better transportation, into education systems so, like, more students have opportunities, like, just into general communities and environments, into a whole lot of different things. And, like, it becomes worrying when we're seeing, like, the merging of a lot of these companies that used to be smaller companies. For example, like, Sprint has actually just merged with T-Mobile of recently, and it's just a thing. It's like AT&T, Sprint, like Verizon, all these things. Like, what if, like, eventually we're coming down to, like, some of these tech companies dominating so much that there's only one or two of them left, and then one eats the other, and then it's monopolized. And I feel like that's a big question that we have to be asking ourselves, especially as companies are trying to diversify what they're offering. Like, Amazon is diversifying what they're offering. They offer Amazon Fresh, they offer Amazon Games, they offer Twitch. Like, Facebook owns Instagram, Twitter's looking at different ulterior, like, platforms. So, like, it's also, like, looking at, like, yes, like, these companies, like, diversifying what they're offering us and offering us more stuff is awesome. But, like, what does that mean in the future about, like, their control over our lives and, like, our will and our freedom to, like, speak up our minds or what we want to say?
I think certainly we're seeing this pattern of these companies consolidating in a way that's sort of similar to the previous industrial revolutions with like steel and oil companies. Now it's happening with our data, and one of the points you mentioned that I want to summarize is, we definitely need to think about the role the government has to play in all of this. Like, we're seeing dark money really flood politics in terms of, we're seeing companies have a huge influence in who gets elected, and the super PACs that help them get elected, and the advertising money like Mike Bloomberg, for example, can spend to alter our opinions using these tech platforms. So certainly this dynamic, this relationship between the big companies and the government is one we have to really consider in the future. But to turn our attention to the big tech companies a bit further, recently, because of the Black Lives Matter movement, we've seen companies like Amazon and IBM stopping facial recognition from being used. And there is this, many tech companies have issued messages of solidarity, Black Lives Matter, and we want to get your opinion on whether or not this change could be sustainable after Black Lives Matter in the long run, or is it that these tech companies are perhaps hypocritical and they're just doing this in the heat of the moment for the PR benefits? We're wondering what you think about that.
Oh, that's a wonderful question. And, like, that's definitely something I talk to a lot of people about. I feel for a lot of people, a lot of the things that they're seeing recently with, like, Black Lives Matter and just, like, starting to care, it's like, I've seen a lot of people where it's like, this is the first instance for them where, like, they're realizing, like, oh, like, Black people are actually in danger, or, like, they don't have a normalized experience in the US, or, like, like, they can live in fear. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I definitely think that it's just sad because, like, for me as a Black person and other people that I know, like, that's always been our reality. But the more people that we can have, like, thinking this way, the more that I think, like, there's aims for, like, progress in the future. I definitely think that a lot of these companies, the reason why they did this is, like, it's a PR move. It's definitely a PR move. For example, like, Amazon is like, we're ending facial recognition software and stuff for, like, a year. But, like, what's going to happen after the year? Why didn't you just get rid of it completely? Like, and, like, to an extent, like, I wouldn't say that we should divest in, like, facial recognition software, machine learning, because there are a lot of beneficial things that could come from that in terms of, like, innovation and having future, like, future products that could be beneficial for us in a lot of different fields outside of just like tech. I feel like tech is very intersectional, and like I'm hoping that in the future, like a lot of people can see like places where tech can be integrated and like can be useful. And I definitely think like there's different areas where that could be useful, maybe even in the health and the medical field more so than like, you know, civilian surveillance. And I feel as if like a lot of these companies, yes, it was definitely a PR move. I feel like it's also a thing. It's like people are realizing like now that Black Lives Matter, the Black dollar matters, and then also like people who are allies or supporting Black people, they at this moment in time, like they are going to be very sensitive to like companies or people who don't speak up or have ill to say about Black people. So like a lot of these companies are saying these things because they know that if they don't say these things, like they may get slack. But then at the same time, it's also worth like reviewing like the types of policies that they've instilled on Black people who do work for them or do produce content on their platforms. For example, Amazon still has a lot to do in terms of like making up for a lot of like, you know, the Black low income workers that work in their warehouses but don't get paid adequately or don't have benefits that properly can support, like they can properly support them or their families. And it's sort of funny to think like Jeff Bezos is like a billionaire, like multi-billionaire, and like he has all this money but his people are still suffering or working under him. And like we also see this with like YouTube, like there's been like a suppression of like Black like creative artists like and Black also like Black female commentators. Like there are a lot of Black female commentators that have come on you know, YouTube to like, you know, give representation and visualization where it's not seen on media. Like whenever we look at films or we see like television sets, like we don't typically see Black females in a positive light, yet there's a lot of these Black females that are coming out talking about like, yes, like I'm wanting to talk about like, you know, maybe controversial issues. I want to maybe talk about like, you know, how like Black women should be more represented in beauty and like look into like, you know, promoting like, you know, beauty products and stuff like that on this platform. I'm looking to like be a political commentator on this platform, but like their views are being suppressed, their videos are being demonetized, marked as like political, like being like surveilled. Like it's unjust and it's unfair, and like it's sort of interesting how we're seeing like these systemic factors also go into these companies and these platforms. And like I feel as if like that's where like I like digress when people are like, oh, there's no such thing as like, you know, systemic like racism towards Black people. Like people say things like that, and like I like for me, I don't like to like, you know, assume the worst out of somebody or like not try like understand where they're coming from. Even though somebody is like overtly racist and ignorant, like I'll be willing to sit down with you and have a conversation and think like, see like why do you think that way, or where is your perspective coming from? And I feel as if like there's not a lot of spaces or platforms for that to happen, because like a lot of these dissenting opinions or marginalized people are being like, you know, pushed off platforms, not given spotlight or utilized or exploited, but like not like, you know, being utilized and exploited, like, you know, to support the company, but then also for PR and visual appeal to get more money. And like, to me, like, this is a conversation that I've definitely been having with a lot of people, but like, I feel like just addressing like racism, anti-Blackness, all these issues, like it starts locally, it starts at home, it starts with social media, it starts with the platforms, it starts with tech. Like, I feel as if like we all want to go and like, you know, go and say like, oh my God, like we need to go and like attack like the systemic issue, like attack the company, attack the government. But like we need to go and like we need to have like, you know, the CEOs of companies look into their companies and be like, where are issues where I notice that like I'm like, you know, promoting inequities for people, whether that be by the basis of like status in the country, by the basis of race, or the basis of income. Where is it in my college community where I am like, you know, making people feel alienated because they have a different experience or background, or like financial status than me. I feel like those are the conversations that we have to start having. Like, instead of looking from the bigger picture, looking at the bigger picture, look at the bigger picture, but look inward and see like where can we at the foundation start fixing things so like the systemic framework looks a little bit different.
Yeah, and we've seen a lot of Black figures in high PR positions, and that's definitely a good start. But we've also seen how time and time again, these systematic problems haven't gone away. So in addition, what systematic changes do we need to make to these companies to turn, their PR promises into tangible policies that can serve us in the long run?
Yeah, I definitely think that definitely when it comes to like diversity or trying to appeal to diverse groups, it's always worth it to have a diverse mind in that field or in that sector. And like, I don't like this whole argument that like, oh, the reason why that there are no Black people in that position is because there's no qualified Black people. Because there are definitely qualified Black people. They're definitely smart Black people that are out there. They're just not getting those jobs. I feel as if for me, like one thing that like I like to like be the one to push the mold of is like, I know like there's this whole pushback with a lot of people over like affirmative action and things like that, for example. And like for me, like I like the UCs don't have affirmative action, and like I got into the UC. I'm like regents and chancellors at this school. I feel like I'm an intellectually capable human being, and I can have like conversations. I could be a critical and crucial part of a team, but like sometimes just because of like, the color of one's skin, people are immediately to think like, okay, like this person is not like capable of like, doing this job. I feel like it's worth like, thinking outside of the box and thinking outside of like these stereotypes that we plan for people, and like making sure that we're making way to allow fair access to these positions and these jobs, whether it be like assessing for values, assessing for like merit, or assessing for skills, making sure that if there's a certain perspective that we're looking for that, or we're trying to target, that we actually go and ask those people, like, how do they feel? It's sort of interesting because you see a lot of PR companies, and like, you can even see this a lot with like, for example, Black skincare and hair care products. Like there are a lot of these skincare and hair care products that are actually made by like non-Black people, but it's known relevantly as a Black brand. But because of the way that it's targeted and the way that it's marketed, because they had Black people come on board, or Black people used to be a part of that board, and like they give advice on like what are things that Black people look for in their products or in the marketing, those same brands have been insanely successful in the Black community, and a lot of people won't even know that they're not Black owned. So like sometimes it's not even about like, making sure that like, oh my gosh, sometimes it's not even about like, oh my gosh, it has to be like explicitly like a Black platform or a Black product or a Black brand, but like making sure that if you're targeting the Black community, you have their best interest in mind, and you know what they're looking for. You know that you're trying to make it like, affordable. You know that you're trying to make it in reach. You know that you're trying to make it culturally sensitive and something that's receptive for them. I feel like that goes not only for like, products that people would buy for, but even like a platform, like having a platform where like, like for example, if people were looking for people to relate to, like I don't have to look up like, oh my gosh, like Black woman, how does she do her hair, to figure out like hair care tips for my hair. Like there could be like a section where I could go to and I can go and look for that, because there are sections for different things like sports, tech, games and stuff. Like sometimes like it could be good if like, companies took the extra mile, especially social media platforms, took the extra mile to maybe make these spaces where people can go and either create these spaces where like, they can go and find affinity groups if they want to, or like it's easier to find and connect with these sort of people on these platforms. I think a platform that does a really great job of that is definitely Reddit. And I feel like Reddit doesn't do it on its own, but it does it in the fact that it really does give like, you know, its users autonomy to create these threads, to have moderators moderate these threads, and then also like provide that anonymity aspect to where like people can be really like, you know, forthcoming with how they feel or having their questions answered or be like vulnerable in a space. So like definitely like Reddit's doing it really well, and like just to see how that can be integrated in different places in tech or different platforms would be really interesting in the future.
Yes, and I think perhaps on a more personal note, you know, Ken and I are both Asian, as you can probably tell,
Mm-hmm.
and for the three of us being part of minority group in the U.S., I think one of the major challenges is really in having a fair and honest representation of
Yeah.
our narrative in
Oh
the
yeah.
public eye. And like you said, there's all these possibilities in terms of how we can express these narratives in a more fair and fashion that can be rid of these stereotypes that other people can
Mm-hmm.
attach to us in different ways that could perhaps hinder
Oh
us.
yeah.
As Asian American, you know, there's the model minority myth, and then there's really a shortage of Asian Americans in management positions in particular, to the extent they've called it like the bamboo ceiling, and how because there's a shortage, that's somehow evidence that we're not capable of being managers, and you know, and all those stereotypes uh, that we have to face being the minority group of the
Yeah.
U.S.
Mm-hmm.
So our question is, for Black community, for Asian community, how can we create more paths for this fair and equal opportunity to express ourselves, and
Mm-hmm.
opportunity into high level positions, so we can actually not just uh, produce good PR, but actually create systematic change from within? Do you think
Yeah.
it is through education? Is it through more affirmative action? Like, what are those actions that we can do to
Yeah.
create those paths forward?
Yeah, I definitely think that you bring up like a really excellent point and like a very like personal and insightful point too. Like I definitely feel as if like there's a collective struggle in like being a minority in the US, and it comes in various facets, and like we all experience it in similar and sometimes like different ways. And I definitely feel like a lot of the points that you bring up are very valid, and like that is like the reason in which like I feel as if like when we're approaching like the framework of like marginalized groups in America, I think that definitely like we shouldn't be categorizing people to fit certain molds or like not being able to like, you know, take on certain roles in society. I feel like sometimes like internally, like I'll speak for like the Black community, but definitely internally sometimes like there's some internal like, you know, dynamics that like whenever you go against the grain or the mold, it's sort of looked down upon because like that's not what had always been accepted, you know. So like I feel as if it's also worth like us in our communities going back and saying like, no, like we need to fix like the way in which like we view ourselves and the way in which we view the spaces that we can take up space in. I definitely think that we also need to make it abundantly clear to other people that we support people who choose to take on these non-stereotypical roles, or that they have the ability and the capability to put on these roles and to do them well. And I feel like part of that also comes with like centering and like giving like just space and like highlighting on like maybe even like not only social media platforms, but in communities, and creating these mentors to where like we can see more of ourselves in positions where we wouldn't typically be seen. And I feel as if like that's what's super important in terms of like getting the message across to like the larger you know, country, the larger population, and just like just making there become this general consensus that, you know, in our communities, even though this person is like doing something that y'all like, you know, y'all like as in like, you know, just the general population wouldn't think that this race or this ethnicity or this gender or this like, you know, background or this economic like, you know, socioeconomic person of that status would be able to do. Like that this is something that, like, you know, community members uplift and they recognize and they're very proud of it. So, like, we need more of it. I feel like that's definitely something that we can have people work on in the future in terms of, like, centering those people who, like, you know, are quite frankly becoming like pioneers in certain fields. Like, for example, you talked about, like, you know, management and like the Asian community and how, like, a lot of people don't feel as if, like, you know, like individuals can take on management roles. I feel like that is very, like, very, very, like, prejudiced and upsetting. And, like, honestly, I feel as if people could have put more emphasis, like, you know, in society on the fact that, like, these roles, these stereotypes are not things to, like, box people into, and, like, we could educate and have dialogue about that with people external to, like, our race, like, that would be, like, do so much in terms of, like, changing the dynamics and, like, what we see for people. And, like, one thing that I feel like the Asian community and the Black community definitely shares, like, a lot of, you know, experience with is, like, definitely representation in, like, management and media, for sure. Like, I feel like it's not until recently that we've started seeing, like, a lot of targeted, like, you know, visuals of, like, you know, Asian families and Black families and what that looks like, and, like, that being pushed into the mainstream for, like, general consumption. And while that's great, it's sort of sad because sometimes we see, like, you know, people who don't possess those identities come in, or, like, you know, some people, like, come in and, like, infiltrate and, like, write out, like, some things that would appear to be like stereotypes. And even though we're happy for, like, that representation, it's not the representation that fully communicates, like, where we're at as, like, a race or a society in terms of, like, you know, moving forward into new endeavors. And I feel like the representation aspect definitely needs to be fixed, but I feel like we also need to assess, like, the ability of, like, mass media and, like, technology to honestly influence social norms and the way people think about other people. Like, because of the things that are perpetuated in TV shows, in movies, on news outlets, the way, like, news is spun, like, it really does do damage on, like, not only the psyche of, like, marginalized people, but, like,
Mm-hmm.
the ability for people to see themselves in positions where, like, you know, they wouldn't be typically found, because that's not what the media
Mm-hmm.
feeds them. The media doesn't feed to them that they could be in that powerful management position. The media doesn't feed to them, like, you know, that maybe, like, oh, getting out of, like, you know, like, the hood is a thing. Like, you know, the media doesn't feed to you, like, oh my gosh, like, you know, like, making sure that, like, giving back to your community, like, there are people who want to focus on giving back to their community, that's a thing. I feel like a lot of these things, like, going back to, like, that whole getting out of the hood notion, like, I feel like that notion in itself, like, that's a notion that a lot of people, like, propagate on Black people. And I don't think that's how it is. Like, for a lot of Black people, it's more about how can I use my higher education and my positionality to also go back and give back to my community. And sometimes these, like, you know, like, romanticizing, like, these romanticized, like, versions of, like, you know, like, getting out of the hood, or what, like, you know, the typical family structure should look like, or how education should be like on TV, can really, like, you know, do damage, or, like, keep people in these boxes. So I feel like it's also on, like, not only social media platforms, but, like, also on media and television corporations to make sure, like, the type of images that they're feeding us and the news that they're feeding us is stuff that's, like, you know, for the most part, more positive and more uplifting, and that centers, like, people who aren't in what would be a traditionally expected role.
And yeah, and I think the three of us are especially cognizant of that, being part of the minority. Like, we can see how corporations really just perpetuate the status quo because that's where their financial incentives are. And to perpetuate the status quo often involves depicting these stereotypes and rolling it out on mass media, and really just continuing to box us in the same positions, like with the whole incarceration system of the African American community. Like we can just really see that in action. And and with that, I really want to thank you for coming onto our podcast. I think the topics we cover will resonate with many, many people. And we definitely do need to take action to create these systematic changes and also pave opportunities for people to continue to break convention and break norms and pioneer new ways of thinking in this country. So we thank you very much, Nicole.
Thank you so much. Like, I honestly enjoyed this conversation. Like, this was wonderful. And it just actually like helped me like reflect a lot on like a lot of ideas and like things that I had been thinking about. So like I really thank y'all for like considering me and like taking this opportunity to like share this with me. Thank you.
Yeah, I appreciate coming onto our podcast, Nicole.
Of course, anytime. Like, thank you for having me. Like, it was wonderful.